Welcome everyone to this section entitled Economic Initiatives, Poverty Reduction and Social Rights. We have 4 fascinating papers that will be presented in this session. Our first presenter is Carleton from the University of New Brunswick, and she's a faculty member in the Department of Political Science. Our second presenter will be Kathleen Diga, and she is a PhD student at the University of Western Cape and a researcher at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Then we'll have Kwasi Majola, who is a PhD student in the College of Law and Management Studies at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And finally, Ralph Calabert from Dalhousie University is a faculty member in the Department of History. So what we're going to do is have 4 15-minute presentations, and then after that we'll have half an hour of questions and discussion.
The paper I'm presenting is called Participatory Budgeting and Decentralization in South Africa. And it's a continuation of some work that I did on the past on participatory budgeting, well, more like alternative budgeting in South Africa, and specifically a project called the Pupils Budget Campaign, which began in about 2001. And is still operating to some extent. And the People's Budget Campaign has been a national level campaign, but there's been talk ever since the beginning about decentralizing it to the municipal level, to local government. And so this paper is based on some materials that I was able to access from the campaign that talks about sort of the latest attempt to try to decentralize it. The project reflects some broader interests that I have in, I guess most generally, in the ways that social movements go about participating in policy debates in the current historical period, and some of the ways that they engage in policy research and go about utilizing policy research. So who they understand their audiences to be, how they engage in research, the uses to which they try to put it, and so on. And within that, I've had a certain interest in the politics of budgets, and I think that it's very much a product of the period that we've been in, that with so much policy being controlled through fiscal programs, through budgets and departments of finance and so on, that budgets themselves have become increasingly politicized. And this campaign is part of a broader process of politicizing and contesting budgets that we see within a range of social movements, and also sometimes taken up by left-wing political parties, as we've seen, for example, in South America. And in South Africa, of course, we saw all these processes taking place in the period from about 96 onwards. And during the period from about 96 till 2008, especially under former President Thabo Mbeki, in a very kind of top-down controlled type of process. Things are a little more confusing, I think, right now under the current president. We've gone from a real sort of top-down approach to policy to one that's more decentralized, and it's a little bit more confusing what's going on. And I'm myself still trying to make sense of exactly what's going on. So as I mentioned, the paper itself is an attempt to first to document what the People's Campaign has been trying to do in terms of decentralizing their campaign, and some assessment of the proposal itself. And I've also been trying to think through how to analyze this, how to situate this in a broader set of questions that I haven't entirely sorted out for myself. So you can definitely see this paper as a first stage in that. Now, the People's Budget Campaign, as I mentioned, began in about 2009, It is sponsored by 3 large social movement coalitions in South Africa. One of them is the Congress of South African Trade Unions, COSATU. One is the South African Conference of Churches, SACC. And the other one is Sangoko, the South African NGO coalition. So kind of a coalition of coalitions, if you like. Depending on how you decide to do the math, you could certainly make the claim that the PBC is a project of groups that represent close to half of the population in South Africa. And what they were doing was trying to figure out a way to respond to the relatively, to 2 aspects of economic policy making that emerged in the late 1990s in South Africa. One was in terms of the content of policies. It seemed to be a framework that was typified under the Growth, Employment, and Redistribution Program, GEAR, that was not a pro-poor economic policy. That was often called sort of anti-poor. It seemed to be focused on growth rather than redistribution, and there were a whole series of critiques that were made within this group of social movements about the policy direction itself. And the second set of concerns had to do with the process, the fact that the policy had been made by a small group of policy experts as opposed to a process embedded in consultation with the government's, the ANC's traditional constituencies. And the People's Budget Campaign was one of a range of responses. And what it tried to do was to present a series of alternative policy proposals and an alternative economic framework that were presented in fiscal policy terms. So they took on board the idea that budgets had to be relatively balanced, that social movements, they accepted the suggestion that social movements needed to be concerned about things like taxation and so on, and not just about spending. But they tried within that framework to argue that you didn't need to have the type of contractionary, very sort of tight anti-redistribution program that was put in place in the late 1990s, that you could have something that was fiscally responsible and yet more redistributive and more growth-oriented and so on. Now, within the movement, and this is based on both written reports the campaign has made and a series of interviews. I've interviewed people connected with the campaign for almost 10 years now, off and on. There were a number of criticisms, internal criticisms that have been made. One has had to do with sort of the limited extent of policy research, or the policy influence, even though there seems to be more openness under the current government than there was in the past. There isn't a lot of indication of real changes being made. And the second one, and this is perhaps more important for the decentralization project, is the distance from the constituents of the PBC itself. It soon became quite clear that the reports that were being written every year were written for government officials and for the media. They weren't in a language that was accessible to the constituents of the PBC coalitions, and I mean that both in terms of the types of policy discourses being used, and quite literally in that they were all produced in English. They weren't being disseminated very well. Many of the constituents didn't have access to the internet. There wasn't much printing. And there weren't many follow-up programs, economic literacy training, any of the things that you would expect to go along with alternative budgets if they were going to be sort of taken on board by the constituents. And so, in other words, they were quite distanced from the people whose voices they were supposed to be representing. And this has been an ongoing matter of criticism, but also a real dilemma. Beginning in 2008, an organization called NALEDI, the National Labor and Education Development Institute, which is close to COSATU, and which has been like the coordinating agency for the People's Budget Campaign, did a survey. They did a pilot survey. They went out into a number of municipalities in the four poorest provinces of the country, and they surveyed people as to what they knew about national government budgets, whether they were interested in knowing more, and tried to look at the mechanisms that might be needed to develop sort of a training the trainers program to broaden capacity at the local level to be able to engage in budget debates. So to kind of shift this out from a national elite kind of discussion to a much more broadly based one. And they found that there was interest among many of the people they interviewed. There wasn't a lot of background knowledge. They also found that there wasn't a lot of infrastructure in place to actually initiate a program like this, and that it was going to be even more challenging and difficult and expensive than they thought. And the NGOs who had been funding this program for quite a while, the international NGOs, were beginning to lose interest in it. So Naledi and the People's Budget Campaign began to look into the possibility of gaining government sponsorship for rolling out participatory budgeting to the local level. One of the things that's interesting about this, of course, is that the Municipal Government Act of 2000 actually has provisions in place for popular consultation in local budgeting, but it hasn't really ever been put into place. So this at least has the potential to sort of further, to build on existing legislation in place. 3 provinces were approached. None of them showed any interest. So the latest attempt is to go to the national government through the skills development program and to try and get some support through that to begin to build out local level consultation. I'm not sure how plausible that is. There are a whole series of dilemmas associated with this, ranging from the nature of the nature of governance in post-apartheid South Africa, to the expense involved, to the capacity of the government units that we're talking about. And when you're talking about the 4 poorest provinces in South Africa, all of them have had, I think all of them have had, at least most of them have had crises of governance recently. So it isn't necessarily going to be easy, even at a technical level, to do this, leaving aside the importance of gaining sort of government championship of it. But you can see how there might be a certain appeal to it. There are, if you look sort of comparatively at some of the similar initiatives in South America and Brazil, for example, there are some similarities and some differences between what was going on there in the South African context. Certainly, similarly, you had a lot of distance between the between sort of the government and the people, if you like. There was a lot of sort of ordinary people were not feeling particularly empowered by the nature of governance. There was a lot of disaffection. There were problems with corruption as well in Brazil. There were a whole series of similarities. But I think there are some challenges as well. One of them being the South African state at the present time is much more centralized than was the case in Brazil, for example, where you first saw the participatory budgets begin to be rolled out, in the sense that the ANC government has tended to like to maintain a fair bit of control over municipal governments. They haven't really permitted a lot of spaces for local government autonomy over the past 15 years or so. So I think that has been one of the challenges. I think another has been that in Brazil, for example, the governments that initiated them at the local level weren't at that time in power at the national level, and hadn't been closely associated with the military government in Brazil. So when they were fighting corruption, they were kind of fighting sort of bureaucrats and politicians who were seen to be part of the old guard. And I'm not so sure that you can say that in South Africa at the moment. I think that there's a lot more, there are a lot more alliances between politicians who have been corrupt or benefited from corruption and the ANC. The ANC, they've often been ANC members, closely affiliated family members, and so on. And I think that that may be one of the impediments to proceeding with this as well. And I guess there are political questions that I'm still sorting through in my head. At the end of the day, it isn't necessary, even if it succeeds, it's probably not going to change the world. It might help out quite a bit in certain specific locales, but certainly I doubt very much it's going to lead to sort of a fundamental transformation in sort of the nature of governance or social relations in South Africa, maybe in the nature of governance to an extent. So I think it's fairly limited as far as that goes. And one of the things that's happened elsewhere is that aid donors, for example, have taken on participatory budgeting under their umbrella and begun to fund it. And when they do so, they become even more limited and conservative. I'm going to end there. Again, I'm really thinking through kind of how to analyze all of this. So what I have more is a description of a project and some sort of knowledge, which I only began to talk about here, about some of the projects that have taken place elsewhere and where they might apply or not. But I wanted to present it now. Hopefully this will stimulate my thinking, and I'll get some interesting questions, and I'll stop talking now. So thank you.
Thank you so much.